Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm coming to you live from Corning, New York, where it is 7 p.m. and a snowy night and very cold. So since this is a program about perfume and glass, I decided that I would feature my scent of the night, which is a parfum on a fragrance called Wolfsbane, which is perfect for really cold weather. So this is a special night for us. We have been doing Connected by Glass series for a while since we shifted into a more virtual world. And this offered us the opportunity to talk about a lot of glass and other related things that we've not been able to talk about before. I should introduce myself. My name is Troy Smythe, and I am the Manager of Interpretation and Education Projects here for the Corning Museum of Glass. The roots of this particular program extends back a few years. When I first arrived at the museum, they had just launched an exhibition of Lalique glass, much of which were perfume bottles, and I quickly became enamored. And now, like many other people, have fully immersed myself in the hobby of perfume, surrounded by perfume bottles from centuries ago and all over the world. And so this represents a particular interest of mine, but I hopefully for those of you who are fans of glass or perfume, it'll be an interest of yours as well. I've got two presenters with me tonight who are going to be sharing knowledge and information about our subject matter. From the museum, Curator of Modern Glass, Alexandra Ruggiero, and the Director of the Institute for Art and Olfaction, Saskia Wilson-Brown. Saskia is our special guest, and I first ran across her bio as I was gathering information about an awards program that I am very interested in, which is actually the Institute sponsors an Art and Olfaction Awards show for fragrance each year. And that was my introduction to her, and I've been very interested in the kind of cutting edge perfume introductions that they have discovered and introduced to the world. And so I was really grateful when she agreed to be a part of our program today. So tonight we're going to be really kind of looking at the intersection of glass and perfume, which is a relationship that goes back very, very far. But I thought we might start with a poll. What I'd like to know is, you put that up there. If I just kind of want to know a little bit about the audience that's out there, I will encourage you to use the chat window. I'm going to be monitoring that. So if you have any questions or comments, but this is also a chance to let us know a little bit about yourself. I'd like to know, would you consider yourself a fragrance fan, a glass fan, both, or neither? So basically, what brought you here tonight is kind of what I want to know. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to answer. And then Scott, my driver, is going to pull up the poll results for us. Fragrance fan and visual arts fan in general. Good. Good. It looks like we've got some fragrance and glass fanatics. Both. Oh, I'm glad to see so many both. Always glad to see fragrance fans and glass fans. I'm really interested in kind of intersections of interest groups, so that's really exciting for me. So thanks for that. Okay, well, we've got two parts to this program. The first part I thought might be a good for those of you who may not be familiar with the history of glass and perfume. That's something we specialize in here at the museum, and I asked Zan if she would be willing to do a presentation that walks you through a brief history of just exactly what that relationship looks like in glass form. So the first part of our night is going to be spent with Alexandra, and Saskia and I are going to be listening and interjecting questions or thoughts if we have them. And you also should feel free to ask questions in the chat as well. And then once Zan has finished her presentation, Saskia has agreed to walk us through the perfume construction of a French perfume that was first created in the 1700s, but was not launched or documented until the 1800s. And so she's going to tell us a little bit more about that as well. Some of you, if you signed up for this, you know that there was an option to purchase a kit so that you could actually take a fragrance tour. Oh, good. Welcome, members of the International Perfume Bottle Association. Love that. Another major fandom in the glass world. So those of you who purchased it, you might want to go ahead and start setting up your bottles, so because Saskia is going to be walking us through those later on the evening. So, oh, Perfumer's Apprentice is here, from where we got our bottles. So yes, thank you very much, Perfumer's Apprentice. I know shipping these days must be kind of slow, so we got everything, as far as I know, on time. So Zan, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, but before I do, I want to ask, this is just one, I have only two more poll questions. So this is the second poll question. Which best describes your connection to glass? My phone is the glass I reach for most often. Some of my favorite heirlooms are made of glass. I love learning about glass history and/or science. I'm a collector, I'm a maker. So which one of those best describes you? And then we'll launch into Alexandra's presentation. How are answers coming, Scott? And I want to know why I can't vote. Okay, a lot of people interested in learning about glass history and art. Few collectors, few makers, great. And for those of you who were right in there with my phone is glass I reach for most often, that would be my close second. Awesome, great, thank you. Appreciate your participation. I work at the museum and that got me hooked. Welcome to the club, Valerie. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra, so you can take it away for us.
Great, thanks, Troy. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you all tonight to share a look at the collection and some glass perfume bottles specifically in our collection. So Troy and I think, are going to kind of go through this together, and we're excited to show you what we found. I'll admit that although I also love perfume, this was an area of the collection I had never truly taken a deep dive into. So this was a really fun opportunity to do that. All right, so would you mind going to the next slide, Scott? Thank you. So one of the first things that immediately came to mind when Troy asked me to do this was Lalique. I hear perfume and glass at the museum, and I immediately thought of this really lovely collection of perfume bottles that were designed in the 1900s by the French glassmaker René Lalique. Troy mentioned this, that we had an exhibition of Lalique work at the museum, and there were so many perfume bottles on view. Lalique was really captivated by the properties and the possibilities of glass as a material. And so he started his career as a master jeweler, and he eventually transitioned from making luxury jewelry to working entirely with glass. And as you could see from this small selection, he made lots of perfume bottles as well. So, in the late 1800s, there were a lot of advances in chemistry that led to the first synthetic perfumes, and that really dramatically lowered costs. Perfumes were no longer kind of this handcrafted indulgence for the wealthy, but they became an industry that catered to this expanded middle class. And so we had this wave of perfumers that rose to meet this demand. They flooded the market with so many products that consumers had a really hard time and kind of trouble telling them all apart. Can you go to the next slide? So glass designers of the time, in particular René Lalique, were hugely influential in creating bottles and packaging that really helped ensure products were easily recognizable so that they stood out to consumers. One of Lalique's first major commissions was for the well-known French perfume maker Coty, for whom Lalique designed this special bottle. And it's kind of hard to see on this image, but the top, the stopper of the bottle is the name of the perfume, cyclamen. So it's included on the stopper, and that eliminated the need for a paper label on the bottom or on the bottle itself. Go to the next slide. So as a designer, Lalique really mastered using the properties of glass, like its optical effects, especially when it was creating perfume bottles. So this colorless bottle, this colorless glass vessel is, I think, one of my favorites. It's decorated with a narcissus or a daffodil flower. And I think, you know, when you're looking at it here, colorless glass, maybe it doesn't look that exciting, but if you could imagine it filled with fragrance, you know, the colored liquid would have really highlighted that pressed design, and it signaled to the viewer, you know, the floral notes that you might find within the glass itself. So he was really kind of tuned in his designs to producing works that also kind of hinted at what would have been inside that bottle. So Lalique created designs for many different companies, and his talent and market savvy really positioned him at the forefront of modern French design, like during his very long, extensive career. Can you go to the next slide, please? So his designs for perfumeries were extensive. I also really enjoyed this example just because it shows how Lalique designed different types of containers with one cohesive theme. So perfumeries often offered to customers the option to purchase a scent both in perfume or in powder. And here you have both stored in these decorative containers that Lalique designed, this kind of star-studded perfume and powder box for, you know, in the night scent by Worth. And Troy, I think this is one of your favorites in the collection, right?
It is, and I'm always struck when I look at the packaging in the perfume world. We call it presentation, but it just looks something I would buy today. I mean, it has an extremely still classic and modern look to it.
You know, glass, though, has a really long history of being used to hold perfume long before the 1900s. And if you go to the next slide, I should also take this moment just to thank my colleague, Dr. Catherine Larson, who helped me kind of pick out and provided some research for what we're about to see next. You know, fragrance was ubiquitous in the ancient world. Scented and unscented oils had medicinal, religious, and personal cosmetic purposes. And so you had these cast and these core formed glass containers like these that are in our collection, which were used alongside containers that would have been made from alabaster or metal or precious stones. And, you know, when Troy and I were first talking about some of these items, he pointed out that these don't have a stopper, which is because the stoppers didn't survive with the glass pieces. The stoppers in these instances originally would have been wax or linen or resin to kind of seal that opening when they contained perfumes. And I think it's pretty interesting that, you know, glass as a holder, as a receptacle for perfumes and for cosmetics is something that's well attested in many ancient cultures and periods.
So I'm noticing the comment from Margaret Corbett that says she's not getting the second line of text at the bottom of the slides. I don't know why that might be. Maybe if my tech crew has any advice, they can perhaps put it in the chat for us. You know, while we're working that issue out, you know, it strikes me that, you know, thinking about the modern perfumes that you sort of started with, and Saskia, this might be a question. Okay, looks like some people can see it all. Okay, interesting. So Saskia, I'm curious. So a lot of the fragrances from antiquity, from 1400 BC, wouldn't have had alcohol in them because it hadn't. I don't believe alcohol existed the way we know alcohol, at least. So maybe the caps would have mattered a little less than they did in modern times.
Possibly. I mean, they would have, at least if you're talking about ancient Greece, they would have primarily been in olive oil as the carrier, which is, you know, is quite viscous and slippery. So I imagine they would have wanted a cat.
Great. And there's some advice on maybe how to expand the ratio at the top to maybe make things a little bit more visible. Okay, sorry, Zan, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
That's all right. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So one of the things, we're a glass museum, so we think about the glass a lot. And so the question kind of arises of why glass? Like, why glass as a container to hold these perfumes, these scents, these cosmetic powders? And, unlike ceramic and metal, glass as a material, it's impermeable, it's non-reactive. And so it really means that none of the products that would have been contained, that would have been held in those vessels, would have been lost either through absorption or evaporation or degradation as it sat within that container. Since antiquity, glass has been a really important material in the storage of perfumes, of oils, and cosmetics. Scents were precious, they were rare, they were expensive, and they were sold and stored in equally precious containers. People were often buried with perfumes and unguents, and core-formed bottles and the liquids that they contained were popular grave gifts in the second half of the first millennium BC or BCE. And by the late Hellenistic period, so that is by like the second and first centuries BCE, you have glassmakers producing a much more kind of limited repertoire of these core form shapes, but in really greater qualities and quantities than ever before. If we could go to the next slide as well. Thanks. And I'm curious, this is a question for Saskia, if you don't mind, but, we see these glass containers, but was perfume really popular at this time? Was it available to a lot of different folks?
Yes. My area of expertise is not sort of, yes, it was. In fact, there was an example of there's a perfume factory from the, I think, 1300s BC in Cyprus that was a 300 square meter factory that was producing scents on what would have been an industrial scale, which attests to the fact that people were buying the materials, but also scents used a lot in the context of religion, like the cult of Aphrodite, worship of Aphrodite, hence the word aphrodisiacs and the connection with smell there. So certainly it was popular, so much so that the Romans later associated being perfumed with a sort of Greekness, and it was suspect.
With the development of glass blowing in the Roman era as well, we see the containers themselves, this like real proliferation of glass containers and vessels for perfume. This is an example on the screen here of an early blown glass vessel. And they were small, they were lightweight, they were quick to produce, especially when compared to some of the more time-consuming processes of the bottles that I just showed you. And I know that not everyone on this call is familiar with the glass terms that we have used, like core forming or glass blowing. And I thought when I'm done with this presentation, I'll put some links in the chat. So if you're curious, you can go to our YouTube channel and see really great descriptions and demonstrations of those techniques, far better than I could do trying to describe them to you right now. Would you mind going to the next slide, please? Thanks.
Hey, Zan, before you do, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
So the surface treatment of both of those look very different from the modern ones, but even from each other. How much of that was original, intended?
Yeah. Would you mind going back a slide then, Scott? Thanks. So the surface area of this bottle here that we're seeing is actually, it's called weathering. So the bottle's been weathered, and that means that it's the surface over time when a glass is buried, it actually begins to kind of take on this iridescence and this flakiness. So that isn't original what we're seeing there. I do love, as an aside, the story of, when we start to see these big archaeological excavations and these ancient glasses are being kind of uncovered and discovered, that iridescence was really sought after. So you have a lot of glassmakers like Tiffany or Carter at Steuben, which is local to here in Corning, kind of trying to emulate those iridescent hues. But yeah, what you're seeing is that weathered surface, so not original. It's a great question, Troy.
Okay, so it wasn't intentional, but
No.
not necessarily an unhappy accident for the modern eye. So.
Yeah. All right, next slide, Scott. So being able to blow glass really meant that glass makers were no longer restricted by those previous techniques. They can make more elaborate, more sculptural forms by manipulating inflated glass while it was hot. And this is one of my favorite ancient containers in our collection. It's a really graceful, stylized form in the shape of a bird, and it would have held perfumed cosmetics. What's so interesting about this to me is that there are still remains of the cosmetic powders inside the bird, which kind of indicate that somehow as these vessels were formed, they were filled and sealed in the workshop. And so it means that in order to access the contents inside, you had to break off the tip of that tail in order to really get to what was inside that container, which is pretty fantastic when you think about what that would have meant and entailed. I could just imagine, for my own self, not wanting to snap it, but also wanting what was inside.
I'm trying to, I've only blown glass a few times, but when I have, it's very clear how hot it is, the 1,000-degree mark, and I'm trying to imagine being able to hold on to that while you're trying to insert, cosmetics into it and then somehow pull the tail close. Maybe it's glass blowers or glass workers out there can explain that this might not have been as kind of worrisome as I'm making it out to be in my own head, but it seems like something that would have been kind of very much of the moment and prized and precious, I guess.
Scott, would you mind going to the next slide? Thanks. So, after the fall of the Roman Empire, perfume traditions really diminished in the areas that were formerly controlled by the Romans. But perfume traditions persisted in Indian and Persian cultures, and the use of glass and perfume vessels also persisted. So although the forms did kind of shift alongside the types of perfumes that were being used. So these two flasks indicate that they held perfumed liquid or thin oil rather than the solid or the paste that were typical of scents in earlier periods. And there's a really small hole at the opening of those necks that would have allowed the person using these vessels to sprinkle and to control the drops that would have come out. So, kind of getting a few drops at a time. And if you don't mind going to the next slide. There is this shift though, liquid perfume continues, and the Middle Ages saw a real rise in perfume production in Europe. By the 1600s, liquid perfumes became quite fashionable, and we see this popularity in a real wide variety of perfume containers and shapes and styles that were produced. And so there are some really fun examples in our collection. And it was really, I had such a lovely time going through our collection for this program to find some of these examples. Here's one of them, which is on the screen, this beautiful little white perfume bottle with enamel painting of flowers on one side of it. And what I really love about glass as a material is its mimetic qualities. Glass can be fashioned to look like other materials. So it can look like agate or rock crystal or porcelain. And so when there are these moments in time where porcelain, for example, became fashionable as a vessel for perfume, you also begin to find examples of white glass containers that have enamel decoration that look similar to those porcelain ones as well.
I'm sorry, we had a question in the chat regarding ancient perfume bottles and research that happens based on the contents that kind of trace remains are there. And the question was, has anyone done any research on those contents? And the answer is yes. I don't know how much we've done it at our museum, but I do know that there's a scholar in Europe, I think it was maybe France, who in the last couple of years reconstructed a scent from one of Cleopatra's fragrances. And in addition, they're starting to also do this with food, finding remains of, I want to say recently it was a bread, and able to recreate the yeast from that time, and recreated a loaf of bread from ancient time as well. So chemical, and with beer, yeah. So kind of, we call it material research. It's really interesting to me. So yeah, I think Saskia may have more to say on that. We're having kind of, I think we're figuring out her tech. Okay, Zan, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's fine. So this perfume bottle, I will just note, it's pretty small. It's about 3 inches, which is not, not a very large bottle. I think, Troy, what you were holding up earlier would have held a lot more than this little one would. And, one of the things I was interested in when I started looking at these bottles is how they would have been stored or carried. So during the 1700s, perfume and cosmetics were no longer just for the aristocracy, but they still remained a luxury. And so were the delicate containers that would have held those perfumes. Glass containers would contain these really precious perfumes. And then you have elaborate packaging that would have held the precious glass containers. And we have a number in the collection. So if you don't mind going to the next slide. Thanks. So these two, for example, these are 2 small green glass vessels that were painted with gold decorations of chinoiserie scenes. These scenes were imitations or evocations of Chinese motifs in Western art, furniture, and architecture. And they were really popular at the time these were produced, in part because of a result from expanded trade with East Asia, especially China, during this period. And I really love that these 2 little bottles fit snugly inside this velvet-lined case that's made of shagreen, which is dyed shark skin. So here you have the shagreen. It's in a green color. The case is further decorated with, gilt metal pins and an enamel band inscribed with the phrase, a phrase in French, which translates in English to "friendship is the price." The whole package is precious. It's not just those glass or the contents, but the entire kind of container. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is one of, I think, Troy's and my favorite perfume bottles that we found, or not found, I knew it was there, but kind of rediscovered during this research for this presentation. This is a stunning container in the form of a glass furnace, complete with glass makers blowing and shaping objects. So this image shows us what it's like with its hinged cover open. So you can see there are 2 glass bottles inside with gold caps. If you could go to the next slide, please. So here it is from all 4 sides. There's a chimney, and the dome of the container has been engraved to look like masonry. The sides of the containers or the walls of the furnace are also engraved to look like bricks. And there are figures making glass. There's a glass maker at a bench, shaping glass. There's someone blowing a vessel. There's a figure reaching in to withdraw a bottle from an annealer. And there's even a man kind of kneeling down and shoveling wood into the furnace. And of course, there are little glass vessels kind of all around this container as well. You could go to the next slide.
Pretty accurate portrayal of an actual glass house.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we don't know really why this was made, like what the background story of this object is, if it was a commission, those details aren't really known, but it is a really accurate representation. And so it's typical of the type of furnace for glassmaking that you would have found in Germany in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. And so that's why it's dated, 1675 to 1725 and attributed to being produced in Germany. And, this piece, it's on view in our galleries, but it's so small that I think some of this detail gets lost on the shelf. So this is where these virtual programmings are really fantastic, because we can use photography to really zoom in and see all of those details.
Sort of speaks to how personal the objects were in and of themselves, meant to kind of be a part of a person's, morning ritual, where they alone could be close enough to really enjoy those things.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide too. I think what I also really like about this, and I've arrowed into it so we can see it a little clearer, is that it also gives us an idea of how these would have been used. You know, these 2 glass bottles with these caps on them, but there's a funnel as well. So you can imagine like using that funnel to refill those vessels with perfume.
Oh, that's awesome. Comes with funnel. Now there's a marketing
Comes with funnel.
genius at play.
Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Of course, though, you know, I showed you 2 really elaborate, you know, 2 perfume bottles in a case, but not all of the bottles have cases or would have had cases. You know, most of the scent bottles that we have in our collection don't contain a case. And I thought that this one, which is a little bit later in date than some of the things we've seen so far, was a really lovely example from our collection. It's from about 1870. It was probably made in Japan by the Satsuma clan factory, which produced really fantastic cut glass objects. And when I was looking through all the perfume bottles that we have in the collection, this one really stood out. You know, I was really drawn to those super geometric cuts and the kind of triangular little protrusions on the edge of the bottle. And it's also pretty small. It's about 3 inches. And, you know, when I was doing this research on how these would have been used or held or carried, some of the earlier vessels would have been maybe carried around in an owner's pocket. And in the Middle Ages, that would have definitely been true. They may have been carried on the go. But once we get into the 1800s, into the 1900s, it's not necessarily the case. And I think with this one, for example, there's a glass stopper that's kind of resting inside the bottle. So it would have been pretty unlikely that this would have ever been taken on the go. It probably would have sat on a surface somewhere. But I think if you can go to the next slide, we could assume that with this one, which is also a pretty small bottle, this one may have been taken, carried, put in an owner's pocket. It has a metal cap, which would have really, you know, sealed on. It's helpful. It's not a stopper that might pop off. And unlike the cut decoration of the bottle we just saw, this one, which I also thought was quite lovely, this bottle's decoration was obtained by blowing glass into a mold, a 2-part mold. So one side of the mold of this design is hearts and the other are fleur-de-lis. And so when the glass is kind of inflated, it expands to the walls of the mold. It takes on that decoration. And so what's great about that technique from a glassmaking standpoint is that you can reuse the mold. You can produce multiples of the bottle. And so you have a great number of bottles that are all the same size, the same kind of exact design.
Does that kind of pave the way for perfumers like Lalique or Coty to kind of make it easier to create a visual brand? The idea that you could press?
Yeah, and you know, Lalique wasn't using pressing, but that same technology of using molds to kind of produce multiples of something. It is how I think he was able to produce such a huge amount, but also, you know, when you think about these large scale perfumers, they don't just want one bottle of something, right? They're ordering many to fill and to sell. So what I thought was pretty exciting about this bottle too, is that this flask was made in France between 1675 and 1699. And it was produced by the glassworks of Bernard Perrault, who is one of the most celebrated glassmakers in France before the 1900s. You know, he was the son of a glassmaker who immigrated from Italy to France, and he founded a glass house in 1668. And probably, we don't know, but, you know, we have this vessel from this time period that maybe could have contained the type of perfume that we're going to learn about next, given its kind of date and the fact that it was made in France. And so I think with that, Saskia.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Xana. There were a couple of questions that showed up in the chat. You know, the one question was, do we know how many bottles could be blown from a mold? And I suspect the answer varies depending on the mold.
It does, yeah. I see Carol also wrote in the chat that, you know, mold blown flasks were used in ancient Roman times for perfumes as well. And it definitely depends on the material that the mold was made of. And, I think back, we had a great exhibition at the museum called Enion, the mold blown Roman glass. And we, our glassmakers at the studio were using kind of plaster molds that wouldn't have had as long of a run time. Like the decoration would begin to get a little softer over time versus something like a metal mold, which would last a lot longer.
And then another question just showed up in the chat of when did Murano begin making perfume bottles? I have to believe that goes back pretty far into kind of when they started working with glass in the first place, just because they were such traders. I don't know if Carol or if anybody else that's more of a specialist in Venetian or.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the perfume bottles also in Murano go back quite some time. We have some really beautiful examples in our collection, more from the 19th century and 20th century, really lovely, Venetian perfume bottles that have kind of adventurine, like this really beautiful sparkle and sheen, as well as a lot of millefiori or cane worked pieces that really harken back to some of the older ancient pieces.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, given, the Venetians were known for trading, they didn't have land, so they made a lot of their fortunes via trade on the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, which happened to be also kind of leaders in perfume manufacture at the time, so, and they didn't waste their time when they were in these places. They kind of learned a lot and, quickly realized that there were, in some instances, it was much more advantageous to actually make the thing they were shipping than it was to actually just ship it. So yeah, that I suspect it does go back really pretty far. I think that was all I had. I don't see any other questions. Looks like Saskia is with us. So before we get to Saskia, I want to ask my final poll question. You could flash that up for me, Scott. So just as all of us have a connection to glass, probably all of us have some sort of connection to fragrance. So which best describes your connection to fragrance and or perfume? So fragrance can be anything that, is a person-made or human-made scent to be experienced. I'm allergic. I enjoy it on others. I have a favorite fragrance or two. I have more scents than I could possibly wear in my lifetime, and odds are that I will buy more, and I'm a maker. So which of those best describes you? And I'm just going to check in. Are we square with Saskia's audio and all that stuff at this point?
Yes,
I see your picture is very clear, so. Okay, great.
How about I say hi, you tell me.
Audio is still a little dodgy, but this is the world we live in. I think it's important for us to be able to see what you're doing, so that's good. So what were our poll results? Looks like a lot of people have a favorite fragrance, few makers. I'm in that fourth category, for better or worse. So great, how fun. And shout out to the people who are allergic to fragrance but showed up to this program anyway. That's always just because you like fragrance doesn't necessarily mean it jives with your physical system. So I appreciate you being here, so thank you. All right, Saskia, we'll turn it over to you. What shall we do?
All right. Well, if my audio stays dodgy, I'll turn off my camera and you won't get to see me, but you will get to hear me. So let me know in the chat.
Hi,
everyone, it's nice to be here. I really admire Alexandra. I admire Alexandra's level of depth of knowledge and experience. So thank you for sharing that, Alexandra. I'm going to go ahead and turn off video so you can hear me better, okay?
That sounds good.
Okay. Okay, hopefully that helps. Okay, good. Are we better? Give me a thumbs up because now I feel terrible.
It's a little better.
Internet.
Yeah, I think it's sounding clear to people.
Okay. Then I'll just keep going, and then if we Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. Good. So, well, sorry I can smile at you, but I'll just smile with my voice. So, my name is Saskia Wilson-Brown. I'm the founder of the Institute for Art and Olfaction here in Los Angeles. I want to really thank Alexandra for sharing her knowledge. It's really amazing to learn all of that about glass. So, the Institute is a nonprofit devoted to experimentation and access in the field of perfume. And that's what we do. So, Scott, if you wouldn't mind getting to the next slide. Thank you. So when you're talking about the history of perfumery, you're really talking about the history of humanity. So while we're going to really focus on 18th century perfume, I do need to talk briefly about the history. So the history of perfume, you can trace it back to ancient Egypt. And then from there, you can trace it through ancient Greece, through Babylonian Mesopotamia, through Rome, etc. So I'm getting that the connection isn't clear from people in the audience. I really don't know what to do. I'm really sorry for this, everybody. And so if perhaps the
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how much control we actually have over.
Could chime in. Yeah.
Yeah, if
I
you're,
could happily call in through my cell phone. That might be the trick.
you
It'd
know,
be easier that way.
let's try that.
Let me do that. So if everybody just sit there for 2 seconds and yeah, let's see if that fixes this. So everyone hang out for 2 seconds and I'll be right back. Yeah, please. Let's see.
Yeah, unfortunately, as much as virtual programming has allowed us to communicate and connect with people from all over the world, all different places, it's oh, we actually did, Tom. But internet connections do change in a quick amount of time. So just know that people on this end are really trying their hardest to get this to be audible for you. So hang in there.
Okay.
Okay, so she's calling in now. I'm trying to figure out how Mary can get those links if she has to log out of the chat. Does anybody on TechN know? What I can do is I can post my email in the address or and Mary, if you want to just send me an email, I can send you the links myself. How about that?
Can you hear me on the phone here?
Much better.
Okay, super.
Yay.
So thank you, cell phone. So everybody, I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened. We had perfect internet all day and then it just went wonky just in time for this call. So I do have to apologize. Thank you everybody for your patience. And here I am pinging in from outer space. All right, so shall we continue?
Yes, let's do.
Okay, super. So as I was saying, terribly, my name's Saskia. I run the Institute for Art and Olfaction, and I'm going to talk about perfume. So the biggest thing I want to convey before we really get into it is that the history of perfumery is really the history of humanity. So, here on screen, we have a beautiful image of the pharaoh Hatshepsut, and I include that image because Hatshepsut was quite important in importing scents to ancient Egypt. Indeed, scents related to Hatshepsut's conception of her own power. And through history, you see scent relating to worship, seduction, especially in ancient Greece with the aphrodisiacs, medicine, power, and of course, commerce. So Scott, next slide, if you don't mind. Great. So that's my point. The history of perfumery is the history of humanity. However, and if you wouldn't mind getting to the next slide, Scott.
Next slide. Yep.
What we're going to do today is really talk about a perfume and the history of perfume that starts with 18th century France. So here is an image that I borrowed from our generous friends over at Corning of Louis XIV. It's a medallion, a beautiful medallion made out of glass. And I include Louis XIV because when you're talking about modern perfume, you tend to talk about a narrative that starts with Louis XIV. And next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Scott. So when Louis XIV came to power in Europe, the main sort of use of scent, you know, there was scent. People did use scent. For instance, on screen, you see a formula or a text describing a perfume called Hungary water in English. And it was made for the Queen of Hungary. And it was one of the first perfumes, you know, in alcohol to reach and be used in Europe. But scent would have been primarily used in the context of medicine. So Hungary water was considered, you know, a cleaning. You cleaned yourself with Hungary water. And also there was a very strong association between scent and health, in the sense that malodor would have been associated with illness. So oftentimes you saw a lot of people bathing with aroma when they could afford it in order to help combat things like the plague, amongst
Only
other
lost 2
ailments
people.
that they would have had. So if we could get to the next slide, please. So, you know, back to our Louis XIV. On the left, we have Louis XIV in a portrait that's at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. And on the right, we have Louis XIV's finance minister, Baptiste Colbert. And the reason Jean-Baptiste Colbert is important to the history of perfume is that Louis XIV was a grandiose person who really wanted to, you know, show himself as the glory of France. And in order to do that, Jean-Baptiste Colbert had to find clever ways of financing that, right? So for all the clothing, for all the wars, for all the glory, money needed to flow. And part of his economic policy was something called Colbertism or mercantilism, where he focused on a French first economic policy, where he started investing, for instance, in scent production in France. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. What that did was that started a sort of industry of perfumery in France that was very closely linked to nobility, and a lot of scents would have been made for the nobility. Now, in 1789, when the French Revolution hit, obviously, you know, this all sort of fell apart. The nobility scattered or was decapitated, unfortunately, and the perfumers as well had to get out of town. So a lot of them scattered around Europe and started sort of exporting this idea of French perfumery being the best, you know, the ultimate of perfume. So what this also meant was within the perfume industry, there was a bit of a vacuum of power. So it's in this context that we start to get to the next stage of perfume history, and that is chemistry. So next slide, our fearless driver. In 1820, thank you, Scott. In 1820, 2 scientists, 2 chemists, a person called A. Vogel from Munich and another person with the Frenchest name you've ever heard, which is Nicolas Jean-Baptiste Gaston Guibourg in France, independently isolated an aromatic molecule that Guibourg went on to publish under the name coumarin. That's known as the first synthetic. And what they did is they were you know, looking for, they were actually looking for some sort of acid. But what they were doing is they were messing around with the tonka bean, and what they did was they figured out how to separate one aromatic component of the full aromatic picture of tonka. That's the first isolated molecule. In 1868, this person on screen, which is William Henry Perkin, figured out how to replicate that molecule without the use of tonka. So no tonka was harmed when making coumarin, and this is officially sort of the begin of perfumery's divorce from nature, which continues, you know, throughout the next century. So if you wouldn't mind getting to the next screen. So coumarin, you know, famously used in Fougère Royale in 1882 and Jiquy in 1889, was followed by vanillin, which was used also in Jiquy. It was isolated in 1858, I should say. Used in Jiquy, of course, famously in Shalimar. That was followed by ionones and then aldehydes and so on. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. What ended up happening is the perfume companies ended up spending more and more energy on creating increasing amounts of synthetics. Not that they don't use naturals, they absolutely do, but synthetics became a really important component of perfumery, and that sort of marks the modern perfume industry. which is the sort of expansion of synthetics and expansion of the industry. The synthetics allowed you to make more perfume at less cost, which allowed you to sell it around the world, which led to multinational companies, which led to the industry as it really is today. So briefly on the industry, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And I promise we're getting to our formula. I'm just giving you guys way too much context. So the fragrance industry doesn't just do fine fragrance, of course. They do flavoring. It's the fragrance and flavors industry. They also do things, you know, environmental applications like little trees, car fresheners here, as you see. And yes, Linda, sorry, I just saw your comment. And yes, that is the same wonderful William Henry Perkin who invented mauve, actually. Yeah, so nice knowledge. So, okay, the industry does fine fragrance. They do environmental scenting. They do home care. You know, you see down there the household cleaner, the laundry spray. This is all stuff that is, you know, constructed by the fragrance industry. The smells are, I should say. You know, personal care like lotion, shampoo, environmental scenting for the home care like candles. You know, incense isn't really a big thing that people produce, but I put it in there just because, you know, it's home scenting. And then if you get to the next slide. But what we're really going to focus on for the rest of this talk, now that you can hear me, is fine fragrance. So just a little bit of an aside about what, you know, perfume is, because we often understand, we say perfume, but sometimes we don't really know what we mean. When I'm talking about perfume, I'm talking about a predetermined combination of aromatics that was, you know, combined intentionally for, again, a predetermined result that is put in some sort of carrier. So earlier, when Alexandra was talking about ancient Greece, we were talking about olive oil being a common carrier back then. Today, the most common carrier is alcohol. So perfume you see on the shelf at, you know, Sephora or Macy's is typically in alcohol. The reason for that is that alcohol carries really well. It carries the aroma really well. It does really well in a little spray, you know, nozzle versus oil that might block it. And because alcohol tends to be stable for long term, so you can sit on the shelf for a while without it going rancid.
Saskia, can you hear me? Speaking
yes.
of stable, we have a question in the chat from Kristen who asked, does the synthetic component make it more shelf stable?
Yeah, I was actually about to segue to that question, so thank you, Troy. So no, synthetics don't make it more shelf stable any more than, you know, some naturals make it more shelf stable. But certain, you know, synthetics, certain naturals go bad faster. So unfortunately in perfumery, there's seldom a clear yes or a clear no. So not really. But you know, if you're using urine aldehydes, for instance, which is a perfume material synthetic, and you leave your perfume in the sun with maybe some bergamot in there, it's gonna go bad and be quote unstable. So it's not a synthetic natural thing. It's the materials themselves. But I will say that the alcohol is more, you know, quote shelf stable than say oil, because oil, as we all know, can go rancid. So I hope that answers your question, Kristen.
Thank you, Saskia.
Yeah, no problem. So Scott, would you mind going to the next slide, please? Okay, so before we move on to our little formula, I'd like to just take an aside about talking about fragrance, because, and this is, you know, we're going to talk about talking about fragrance, so it's a little bit meta, but bear with me. But it is sort of famously difficult to talk about scent. So I'm just going to talk you through quickly four ways that people talk about scent. It's useful, you know. So first we have what I call, or what's called the family type classification. And on screen you see what's known as a fragrance wheel. Now this is a public facing wheel. Perfumers use similar things, but with simple actual aromatic notes on them. In this case, it's designed for salespeople, you know, at the sales counter to be able to say, okay, well, if you like mossy woods, you know, you're in the woody category and you might like these perfumes. So, you know, you'll see things that are very easy to understand, like green and fruity and floral. And then you see things that are a little bit more abstract, like amber and, you know, I don't know. For me, water could be a little like, I don't really, because water doesn't really technically smell. Well, I guess it would, but not, I don't know. It doesn't smell like, you know, perfume. So these are things that are sort of industry understanding. So amber, you know, traditionally the amber accord would have been a combination of benzoin, labdanum, and vanilla. But in this case, amber is replacing another category that was named that recently changed. So these are things you just sort of have to get to know, but it's a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with perfume, like sometimes what these things mean. So Carolyn, the word perfume, and this is, I'm quoting my friend Sarah Horowitz-Tron here, perfume is through smoke. So yeah, oh yeah, thanks James. Hey James. Okay, so next slide please, Scott. So we had the family classification. Now we're looking at the evaporation classification. And so this is often when you're talking about fragrance construction, people explain it along this line. So top notes, middle notes, and base notes. Top notes, you know, in the natural world are things like citrus, you know, lemon, orange, grapefruit. And what top note means is that you smell it right away and it disappears just as quickly. So that's top notes. Flowers, greens and spices are middle notes. Those last up to 2 or 3 hours typically. Top notes will last up to an hour. It really depends on who you ask. And then base notes last the longest. So some base notes can last, you know, on your skin up to 48 hours, depending on the base note. Next slide, please, Scott. And then another thing that people talk about when they're talking about fragrance is the solution strength. So, and you'll see these very broad sort of segments of numbers that are pretty, you know, it's a pretty wide amount of difference there. But the reason for that is that, you know, there's no sort of industry agreement. You know, different companies have different opinions about what makes a perfume versus an eau de parfum. And certain things can have perfume strength because the materials are so strong, but they're actually in a higher amount of alcohol. So, but in general, you know, you can assume that a perfume will have between 15 and 25% of actual aromatic, and the rest will be carrier. Eau de parfum 8 and 15, and so on down the line. Typically, the least scented object in the perfume pantheon is soap, although I've had some soaps that are stronger than that. So, and yes, Carolyn, for sure, you know, we can get into the history of religion and perfume, but certainly some very early instances of use of scent would have been in the context of worship and incense and smoke, and the idea was that it connected with the gods through this intangible medium. So yeah. Next slide, please, Scott. So okay, without further ado, our formula. Next slide, please, Scott. Sorry. Cool. So this is a formula that I took from a book called The Art of Perfumery that was written by a person called G.W. Septimus Pias in 1855. The formula itself, Pias says, was written by two perfumers, Mr. Henny and Mr. Dietrichson, sometime in the 1700s. He doesn't specify when. I show you this on screen because I want you to have a sense of how these formulas would have looked. I mean, this is from 1855, so it's not that old, you know, but it is nonetheless not new. So, you know, at the top you have your carrier. In this case, it's some sort of brandy, spirit of brandy. Under that, you have otto and lavender. Now, otto is used here synonymously with essential oil. So this is just a, you know, lavender essential oil like we can get today. And you see 2 ounces, which is quite a bit. And then underneath that, you have clove essential oil. He doesn't specify if it's clove leaf or clove stem. Today we have the option of both. Maybe then he was just distilling some cloves as the whole clove. Roses, he doesn't specify which rose, but there's 3 drams there. Bergamot, 1 ounce. And then beneath that, you have extract of musk. Now, at the time, musk would have been a material that was extracted from the hindquarters of a little deer, a little musk deer in the Himalayas, a sweet little tiny deer. And the musk is something that the deer produces in its, you know, let's say anal region. Today, of course, we use synthetic musks most or almost entirely because, you know, I don't know who wants to hurt a little deer, but then it would have been a natural musk.
I had a question in the chat, Saskia. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Lori wants to know, is otto related at all to the term attar?
So otto here is used synonymously with essential oil. Attar in Arabic is a word for perfume as a whole, so it's not specific. But then in India, attar is typically a material mixed with sandalwood. So unfortunately, you know, there's a lack of precision in perfume that can be pretty maddening. But in this case, we're using otto as a synonym for essential oil.
Okay, thank you.
Kristen, yeah, no problem. And Kristen, I often ask that, I often wonder that myself, like who decided to smell the hindquarters of a little deer and said, delicious, you know?
I don't know who it was,
Today,
but I'm glad it wasn't me.
yeah, thank you to whoever it was. They helped us perfume, and I got to get to something weirder. So then we have vanilla, which we all know vanilla. You know, it's vanilla, and then the last material in this accord is ambergris. And now, like musk, ambergris is the byproduct of an animal. In this case, ambergris is the byproduct of a sperm whale. And what happens is a sperm whale is floating along in the ocean, very happy, and he eats a little squid. And the little squid has a little beak. And for certain sperm whales, that beak presents a problem. And it grows it gets lodged in a certain part of its intestines, and it grows this substance around it. And actually, that's a fatal thing for the whale, apparently. There's a book about this called Floating Gold, which is fascinating. And I'll put it in the chat for everybody. But so essentially, the sperm whale dies, and then the little bit of goop, you know, that formed around the squid beak floats to the ocean, floats on the ocean, lands on a beach somewhere, and that is, excuse me, that is found at some stage by some lucky person walking along the beach, and they, lo and behold, they're millionaires. At least that's the mythology. Ambergris basically is this sperm whale effluvia. And, you know, it smells phenomenal, but the supply chain, of course, is extremely unreliable. So these days we use almost entirely synthetic, although some people still use natural. Okay, so you know, Pièce goes on to say that the mixture must be made at least a month before it is fit for sale. This is quite common. Perfumes tend to sit after they're made. And yeah, so if we could get to the next slide. Yeah, and Troy, actually, as a quick aside, you know, oftentimes, you know, one of the byproducts of whaling, if you were lucky, you know, you could come across a chunk of ambergris in one of the whales. So people always looked for it when they were whaling. But you can't force the ambergris. It has to happen naturally. So, and Carolyn, at the end of my talk, I'll be sure to put a recommendation list. I have one on our website.
Another question, okay. What is rondelicia?
I actually don't know what it means. Hi, Rachel. Nice to see you. I don't know.
I'll Google it.
Your guess is as good as mine. I imagine it has something to do with roundness or circles, but yeah. I don't know. It's not French. It might be Italian. I don't know.
It
has a nice name. It's a what?
It's a flower.
Okay.
Endemic to the neotropics.
Oh, that's interesting because the perfume has nothing to do with that flower. So maybe they took the name.
Not one of the notes.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Fun fact. Okay, I chose this formula, you know, because, you know, our friend Septimus Pièce just loves it. And I was like, okay, well, what is he talking about? Let's find out. So, you know, you see here on the screen what he has to say about it. He also goes on to say that it's one of the rare things in perfume which is original. In fact, I'll read you directly what he says. He says, it is such combinations that constitute in reality, quote, a new perfume, which though often advertised is very rarely attained. So this was a nice enough fragrance that, you know, this rather catty and caustic person, Septimus Pièce, his book is full of these little snarky asides, thinks it's fantastic. So that's why I chose it. So we'll find out together. So next slide, please. So this is the original formula that we just saw. I just converted it into something we could sort of read easily. And then if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. This I converted it into sort of modern terms because, you know, drams and ounces are not very precise. The reality is when we're working with fragrance, what we're typically doing is working in weight. But since most of you, I imagine, don't have scales, and I thought maybe after this talk you would want to maybe reconstruct this fragrance, I cared to make it in drops here. So you can take a screenshot of this if you want. Otherwise, I'm sure we'll find a way to get this to you. But this is the formula for the perfume itself. So once this talk is over, if you have, you know, the wherewithal, the desire, you can construct it. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now, and it's really a pity I can't see you. I might try turning on my video on my laptop. No, okay. That's okay. So what we're going to do now is for those of you who have how many of you actually have the kit with you? Maybe.
I should have gotten a poll for that.
Yeah, that would have been okay.
Just
Cool. Sweet. Well, so great. So some of you have it. So fantastic.
Okay.
So those of you who have it, that's great news. I'm so glad. Those of you who have it, what I'd like you to do is get your scent strips that you have in the kit, and I'm going to have to walk you through this with my words versus my visuals, which is going to be fun. Every scent strip needs to be dipped in one of the materials separately. So, you know, you could take one scent strip, you can write lavender on it. I highly recommend you write the material on it, and you dip it in the lavender. And do the same for all the materials. Each material gets a strip. And then what we're effectively going to be doing is we're going to be making what's called a paper blend. And this is something that I learned, I have to give credit to Yosh Han. When I first started this, I took a class with her and she talked about paper blends on strips. So it's a way of sort of short-circuiting the actual blending process and getting a sense of how something smells. And people use it all the time. Oftentimes when I'm first coming up with an idea for a fragrance, for instance, I'll put all the materials on paper and I'll sort of stick them together in a nice little fan like you see on screen, and I'll wave them under my nose. So go ahead and do that. And then what I'd love to do is when you've done it, any thoughts in the comments?
So we do one strip per bottle.
One strip per bottle, yeah. And then what you do is you hold them together in a little fan all together. Make sure that the strips are separate but close to each other. So they don't want to be touching because that might cross-contaminate. Emily, thank you for coming. And I want to take a moment to, again, apologize for our Wi-Fi. I don't know what happened. It was just one of those freaks of the internet where suddenly
You don't control the
Wi-Fi.
internet.
I don't. I wish I did.
If you did, we wouldn't be able to have you for this show.
Yeah, life would be really easy if I controlled the internet.
Is the Tonka tone, what? Oh, that's the musk. Okay.
So yeah, the Tonka tone is the musk. So what I'll do quickly is I'll actually walk you through our replacement materials. So, you know, bergamot is bergamot. It's the same as it was. So that's pretty easy. You know, when they say auto bergamot, I'm like, okay, great, essential oil. What I should say about bergamot is that bergamot is restricted by an organization called International Fragrance Regulatory Association, IFRA. And the reason it has been restricted is because it can cause, if you put it on your skin raw and you put it out and go out in the sun, it can burn your skin. So bear in mind that bergamot on its own, on your skin straight, is often an issue. I believe we have a bergamot that is known as FCF free, which is less of a problem. So, but for bergamot is somewhat restricted now. The lavender, easy peasy. You know, the lavender he would have been using would have been probably similar to the one we're using. In our case, we're using a lavender from France, which is, you know, a nice lavender. Actually, sorry, to go back to the bergamot quickly, what we're actually working with is a bergamot made by Givaudan, which is a fragrance company, which is a combination of different bergamots. So I believe it's good to go.
And for those who may not know, what bergamot is, it's a citrus, right?
Yeah. Sorry, that's such a key point. Yeah, bergamot is a citrus. It looks a little bit like a lime, but it's got a thicker rind, and it's from southern Italy originally. And you know, you see it a lot in food in southern Italy, like bergamot, you know, things in food. But in the U.S., not so common.
And someone asked if this musk was synthetic, and yes, it is. No civet was harmed, and
no pretty little, exactly. So let's talk briefly. Well, let's talk through the materials, and then we'll talk about the musk quickly. So the next thing we have is rose key accord. Now, what a rose key accord means is it's a pre-combined rose perfume. What that means is that somebody went ahead and made their version of the rose. So if you imagine the smell of a natural rose, what you're smelling is a whole bunch of aromatic molecules combining to make the larger rose effect, the larger rose smell. So an accord is basically a perfumer doing the same, taking all the molecules that they know are in rose, you know, like I don't know, phenylethyl alcohol, gosh, Eugenol, there's so many, I don't even know where to go. And what they do is they make their favorite version of the rose, you know, so that's what we're smelling with rose. So it's not a natural rose, it's a pre-combined rose that was made by Perfumer's Apprentice. And I love using Perfumer's Apprentice accords because oftentimes they will publish the formula for the accord on their website, which is generous and cool. And then you can not only smell it, but you can also recreate it if you wanted to.
They have so
So
many
next we,
things.
go ahead, Troy.
They have so much stuff. I mean, I'd never been on their website until we put it up there.
Oh my gosh, without Perfumer's
it's kind of
Apprentice, I
amazing.
couldn't have started my nonprofit. Like, they are amazing. Yeah, and they're nice people. And I think one of them's on the
Yes.
call, so maybe we should stop being.
Oh, sorry.
He's
Well,
probably embarrassed.
Well,
I'll write it down.
yeah, and it's there's a link to that rose accord in the chat.
Yeah, super. Thank you. Okay, so that's the rose. Then tonka tone. So this is our synthetic musk. So, you know, musk, you know, back in the 50s and 40s and 60s, they realized that musk performs really well in these newfangled gadgets known as washing machines and laundry machines and things like that. So they started making a whole bunch of laundry detergent. But because, you know, musk, obviously, you know, there's not enough little musk deer to fill that many washing machines. The industry really focused on finding good synthetic replacers, and they did. They came out with, you know, musks with names like Galaxolide and Cosmone and Habanalide and these beautiful 1950s names that always remind me of sort of old cars with tail fins, you know. And that's what we're smelling. We're smelling one of those older musks. It's a synthetic. Again, no musk deer was harmed. But you'll notice that the tonka tone, you know, if you smell it, it really doesn't remind anyone of a deer rear end. It's pretty, you know, and we associate it kind of with cleanliness. So in that sense, we're being a little bit divergent historically from the original formula in that our musk has been defanged, as it were. But nevertheless, you do get a little bit of a funky fecal note if you kind of stick with it. And so that's sort of our nod to the deer hindquarters. Our vanilla is synthetic. We're using vanillin crystals. You know, vanilla, as we saw, was the second, you know, synthesized molecule. And then beyond that, we're smelling ambergris essence. So again, ambergris being an animal byproduct, I personally tend to avoid it, you know, not because I don't think it's great, and no whales are, you know, willfully harmed in the production of ambergris, but it's expensive, it's rare, it's unreliable. So what we're smelling here is an ambergris replacer. Yeah. And so the thing that Septimus P.S. liked so much about this formula was the combination of the lavender and the clove specifically. He felt that was a new combination, you know. So, you know, if you sort of want to smell those two separately, you can take out the strips and just hold them to your nose and see how they ping back and forth between one another. Joan, I believe this is being recorded as we speak. So I might re-record my introduction for everybody and send it as a video so you guys have a clear recording, but I'll talk to Troy about that. Okay. So last slide, please. Thank you. Excuse me. I can't mute myself when I cough on my phone, so forgive me for coughing. So, you know, this is a paper accord. You know, you have a sense of what this thing would smell like if you sort of wave it all together. If you did want to make this actually in liquid form, a couple of things that I'd like to sort of give you a heads up on. One, you'll need small tubs in which to mix. So at the Institute, we use sort of these little plastic salsa tubs from Smart and Final. It's not very glamorous, but they do the trick. You can also use tiny cups, I don't know, just a little container to mix your materials in. Don't use a container that you will also use for your food. You'll want pipettes and droppers, which is what you would use to mix. And you basically take the pipette, take the material, and dropper them into the tub in the combination that I showed in the formula. And that effectively would make your perfume. Now, I will put in the chat that we have more information and links at our website. Yes, so Gail, yes. So the next step, if you did want to make it in a perfume to use, is you would buy some sort of carrier. They aren't diluted enough. So definitely would invest in a little bit of DPG. You could even do olive oil, you can do alcohol, whatever you have that you think would make a good carrier, pop it in there. and pop it at least at a 50-50 ratio. I would even say 40 to 60, 40 aromatic, 60 carrier. Okay, so the link that I'm about to put in the chat has links to sort of some suppliers, including where to get, materials, and hopefully that will be helpful. If not, please, because you can't see me, I'm going to give myself as a resource. Please email me, at hello@artandolfaction.com, and I can easily see through what you do next. And we did it despite the internet. Yeah, and Travis does point out, and thank you, Travis, please make sure to wear gloves, and also please don't get it in your eyes, or please don't put it in your mouth. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just realizing that as I'm in my neighbor's basement because my internet connection is usually bad. And
Yeah.
their basement now smells like this perfume. So, pro tip: don't wave it after you dip it into the bottle.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really sorry about the internet again for the 8th time.
Can't do anything about it. But we really do appreciate everyone hanging in and being patient with us. And I'm hoping that this will actually be the beginning of other programs related to perfume and glass. I think there's a lot of content there that's really interesting, and both perfume and glass are still innovating today. So and glass and perfume are still going strong. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to watch the program again, it will be available on our YouTube channel. I'm not sure exactly how long it will be before that gets up there. But keep an eye out on it and catch up with us later. Any questions from our attendees before we go, for Saskia or for Zan or for me? I'm seeing lots of thank you, Zan and Saskia. All right.
You're welcome.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun to do. And I'm really excited about my little fan perfume. Okay, all right, so we've got looks like some people are interested in having a series, so that's nice to hear. Okay, well, I think we'll sign off. And we appreciate everyone coming and, like I said, hanging in with us. And we hope to see you at one of the other museum's programs, or hopefully at the museum. We are open every day. Even during the pandemic, we do have really strong safety precautions in place to keep you safe. And we do hope we'll see you at some point in the future. So, it looks like somebody came in July. Great. Well, yes. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll hope to see you again. Bye.
Thanks so much,
everybody.
Saskia. This smells great.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, good. You can put it in your car.